Uli, welcome. Thank you for joining us at the 6th Future Leaders Program workshop of DLD, Development Leadership Dialogue. This week we are discussing the role of development finance, both domestic and international, and also trying to figure out how the financing strategies can be integrated with the production strategies. And I mean, your work on the green central banking has been making huge impacts, and we are very grateful that you are here to help us think through this. First of all, you have been advocating the importance of domestic development finance. Of course, I mean, you are not saying that international finance is not important, but you've been saying that we need to pay more attention to this, and I mean, I think it's a very, very important point. So can you explain to us why you think domestic financial mobilization is important, and what we need to do to make that more impactful?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's really a great pleasure to join this program again. And well, on your question, I think, first of all, we need to get real about the limits of mobilizing international private capital. I mean, I'm all in favor of, reinforcing efforts to get more international capital into developing countries, but we have to be sober in what's happening. And, if we look at the return expectations of international private investors, that often doesn't align with the reality down on the ground. So a lot of climate and SDG relevant investments will not create a cash flow and returns, financial returns that will really lure private international capital. So that's just a fact. Yeah. And so I think we need to take a sober look at the billions to trillions approach that the MDBs have been promoting. And the reality is that we haven't seen trillions flowing, and we also haven't seen huge multiplier effects. So this kind of project-based de-risking strategies, they can work, but the scalability is very limited. And while we haven't seen the trillions of international capital flowing into climate action, SDG action in developing countries, we've actually seen a lot of capital flowing into the wrong direction. Yeah? So a new study that we're just publishing there, we show that over the last 2 decades, developing countries, excluding China, they've built up foreign financial assets to the tune of $15.5 trillion. Wow. Yeah? So that's a lot of money, and we argue that at least part of that money could be invested domestically. And another really important point is that if we look at the history of economic development, I mean, I don't need to tell you about this, but we haven't really seen a single economy, except perhaps some petro-state, that managed to develop without mobilizing domestic savings, without developing a domestic financial system that can really provide credit to productive industries. And one of the big problems of economic development is the high cost of capital. That's right, yeah. And if countries are not able to basically get this savings mobilization going and then build a financial system that then can create new credit and create a kind of virtuous cycle, this cost of capital problem will not be solved, because all this external finance will predominantly be foreign currency financing. And that creates all kinds of macroeconomic and financial problems.
Thank you. Yeah, you have recently published this very important report, Scaling Up Green Investments in the Global South. And in the report, you have emphasized the role of national development banks. And can you explain why you think national development banks are so important, and what kind of roles they should play in making the world more sustainable and more stable?
Yeah, it's very much related to what I was just saying before on, kind of domestic financial resource mobilization, developing markets. And financial markets, banking markets and all that, they don't develop just by themselves. You have to build these markets. And again, if we take a bit of a look into history, economic history, we can see that basically in all countries that were successful in developing, public financial institutions have played a critical role in mobilizing savings and financing development. That's the case for my home country, Germany, where in 1778 in Hamburg, the first public savings bank was established to mobilize savings to finance local development. Here in the UK, in 1861, the Postal Savings Bank was created. The Japanese actually...
Yeah, they learned from Britain.
Yeah, a decade later, the Japanese also established the Postal Savings Bank. And it's been really fundamental in the Japanese development story. But also after the war, for example, after the Second World War, in Germany, with the help of the Americans, with the Marshall Plan, the KfW was set up, which really played a critical role in helping development after the Second World War. Again, similar story in Japan with they set up a rehabilitation finance corporation that was then turned into Japan Development Bank, which again was key in mobilizing domestic savings, in financing development. And of course, I don't dare to tell you anything about South Korea. But,
Korea Development Bank.
There was a critical role, but also China. Chinese economic development without public development banks it would not have happened. But it's also Singapore. Singapore, actually one of the first things they did, that Lee Kuan Yew did after Singaporean independence, was to establish the Singapore Provident Fund, which is a pension fund. And in Singapore, they've had, from the start, mandatory pension contributions. So all Singaporeans that have an employment contract have to pay into the pension fund. And this pension fund was really instrumental in financing infrastructure development, public housing. The vast majority of Singaporeans live in public housing. That's been financed through this. And now, I don't want to say that public financial institutions are the only solution and they will save us and so on. But I want to point out that well-managed public financial institutions really played a critical role in all countries that really managed to develop, except, as I mentioned, some petro-states which have a totally different model. But so I would argue that for today's low-income, lower middle-income countries, well-managed, well-run public financial institutions can play a critical role. And so what we've been calling for is let's use the power of MDBs, of international development finance institutions, to work with national development banks, or in some cases set up new national development banks, that can really do in these economies what the KfWs in the rich countries have done there.
Yeah, actually that leads me to my third and final question, which is, these multilateral development banks, the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, while they were, themselves being development banks, they were advising developing countries to shut down the national development banks. But I think there's now recognition that that was wrong, and that they are beginning to look more closely towards working with and promoting and even newly establishing national development banks in the developing world. So can you tell us a bit about how the way these MDBs or the multilateral development banks operate needs to change so that they could work with and promote national development banks for the development and sustainability?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the perception of public development banks has changed. So throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as part of the Washington Consensus and all that, there was a lot of talk about public policy failure, and public development banking was really portrayed as being, at best, highly inefficient, at worst, totally corrupt, so there was this notion that the best thing you can do with these things is just shut them down. And to be clear, of course, there have been poorly managed public development banks around that absolutely deserve to be shut down. There still are poorly managed public development banks. But then again, looking at the private financial sector, it's not that there are no rotten apples. But no one in their right mind would say, okay, let's shut down all commercial financial institutions. So we need a right balance. And I just want to emphasize, I'm not out there to say that we only need public development banks, but we need a good mix. Well, I would say, MDBs have been also becoming much more open, and we already have some good examples of MDBs working with national institutions, supporting them. We even have some nice examples of setting up new institutions. My favorite example is the Development Bank of Nigeria. Nigeria has a very distinguished history of failed development banking. So with various institutions that were partly set up during colonial times or in the kind of post-colonial era, which basically were all badly managed, totally corrupt, and the capital had been depleted, and at some point they were shut down, rightly so. But then in 2015, kind of the Development Bank of Nigeria was established. It's actually modeled upon KfW. So it does not give credit directly to end users, but it's working as an intermediary with commercial banks in Nigeria. And importantly, a number of MDBs have provided capital. So the European Investment Bank and the African Development Bank, they have provided equity capital to help set it up. Of course, it's majority owned by the government, so these are minority stakes. KfW, World Bank, AFD have also provided debt capital. So basically helping to set up this institution.
Very interesting. Yeah.
There are external board members, so trying to set this up with high governance standards and so on. And it's a young institution, but so far seems to be working very well. And actually so well that a couple of years later in Ghana, the development of Ghana was set up with the same model. And so what I would like to see is have discussion about more such efforts. And one thing that's really important, of course, so MDBs, international DFIs, they can support such national institutions in, with capacity building, in strengthening governance and all that. And that can make a really important contribution. But what I find particularly important is making sure that these institutions also have their balance sheets strengthened. And that's where, of course, MDBs and institutions like KfW, BII can make a huge contribution because they can access cheap capital, and so they can either by providing equity capital or could be also some form of callable capital, or subordinated debt, which is basically hybrid capital, which has the same effect on the balance sheet as equity capital. That could, in some cases, really make a difference, and also change the perception, because everyone will know, okay, this is not just a Nigerian public institution, and be a little bit suspicious, but you will have representatives from international institutions with strong corporate governance standards and so on the board, so it can reinforce the credibility of these institutions when they're set up anew. And there are, again, great examples out there. For example, there's the East African Development Bank, which is the development bank of the East African community. And now the member countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, they are the majority owners. But they've brought in a couple of external shareholders, again, minority shareholders, including the African Development Bank, the Dutch FMO, also until recently the German investment corporation, which is a KfW subsidiary. And so the international credit rating of this East African Development Bank, so they actually have investment grade, whereas all the member countries are non-investment grade. Yeah? So with the support of these external actors, they have turned this institution into a internationally recognized, credible institution.
No, thank you so much for your very enlightening comments and very succinct explanations. Well, thank you, Ulrich, for agreeing to be interviewed by us today. Thank you even more for your continued collaboration with DLD, and I hope it continues. Yeah?
Well, it's my great pleasure, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.